Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review is brought to you in part by Rogers Hobby Center in Saginaw, Michigan, where the fun begins.
This review covers the Autocar DC99648 dump truck. It's an AMT kit, number A1150, and it's in 1/25th scale. Now it's got about 330 pieces, and it is made for the advanced builder. Now it looks to be about the 4th generation of the Autocar dump truck kit that they've released, the first one coming out in 1972. There have been a number of remakes since then, and the original 72 box art has been reproduced in this 2019 release. Now, this looks to be like I said, the 4th generation, and you can find them out there still on the market. Now, the pieces are molded in white, clear, red, and clear orange, chrome, black vinyl tubing, and has black vinyl tires and water slide decals. The instructions are nicely laid out, and the dimensions are 12 inches long, 4 3/4 inches high, and 4 1/4 inches wide. Here are the contents of the kit. My version of the open box review. It'll take you about 10 seconds to see all the pieces, and I won't bother trying to pick up each one and make up some words about the parts. Here they are. Takes you about 10 seconds. Now we'll be using Model Master's liquid cement, sometimes super glue, and white glue for window parts. Decals for the kit are very colorful, and some of them are a little bit on the delicate side. You may need some patience, hot water, and setting solution to put them into place. But they're very colorful, and they work very well. Now grab these pieces out of the kit to assemble the engine, as that's the first step. Now assemble both engine halves, and then add the rocker arm covers, the front cover, and the oil pan to the block. Now the engine then can be painted a flat tan color. Use these parts and assemble the halves of the transmission together, and then the rear plate can be attached to the transmission assembly. Now that is painted a semi-gloss black, and the assembly then can be glued to the engine assembly. And remember to scrape off any paint, or chrome for that matter, when you're putting two parts together for good adhesion. Locate these pieces from the kit, the water outlet, breather, and the oil filler cap, and then they'll be attached to the rocker arm covers. Now the filter halves are assembled and then attached to the water outlet. Then the outlet, the breather, and the oil filler cap are painted Tester's flat tan color. Next, get these pieces, and the exhaust manifold is painted burnt orange, iron, and the starter can be painted semi-gloss black. Then the water manifold and the dipstick are flat tan. Now the exhaust manifold, starter, water manifold, and the dipstick can be glued on to the right side of the engine assembly. Find these pieces, and then the water pump belt and the fan belt are painted semi-gloss black, the pulleys, and then the Model Master flat black can be used on the belts. Now the fan is painted semi-gloss black, and the water pump belt is attached to the front cover. Now the fan belt is attached to the water pump belt, and then the front cover as well. Now the fan can be attached to the fan belt. Using these pieces, the upper oil cooler halves are assembled, and then the upper oil cooler assembly, alternator, and oil cooler are painted gloss black. The alternator belt is painted gloss black as well, the pulleys that is, and Model Master flat black for the belts. The alternator is attached to the alternator belt, and the belt assembly then can be attached to the front of the engine assembly. Now the upper oil cooler is attached to the right side of the engine, and then the oil cooler can be glued on to the upper oil cooler and the right side of the engine as well. These parts are up next, and the air compressor intake manifold, external oil line fuel filters, fuel pump and the fuel pump line are painted flat tan. The air compressor then is attached to the left side of the fan belt, and the intake, manifold, external oil line, fuel filters, and the fuel pump are attached to the left side of the engine assembly. The fuel pump line is attached to the fuel pump. We'll go on to the wheels next, and the two front wheel inners are painted silver, and the two front wheels then are painted gloss red. The front wheel outer side is attached to the front of the front wheel, and the front wheel inner is attached to the back of the front wheel. Now the front flotation tire can be snapped onto the front wheel assembly. So repeat that for the second front tire assembly. We'll have to find all of these parts for the rears, and the four rear wheel outer flanges and four rear wheel inner flanges can be painted silver, and the four rear wheels are then painted gloss red and detailed with some silver. Now the four rear drum brakes are painted semi-gloss black, and the rear wheel outer flange is attached to the front of the rear wheel, and a rear wheel inner flange is attached to the back of the rear wheels. Now a rear brake drum is also attached to the back side of the rear wheels, and two tires are then installed onto the rear wheel assembly, and then we'll keep the process again to repeat that for the three other rear wheel assemblies. As we go through the kit, you'll see that these are some old molds, and there'll be some flash here and there. Just to scrape it off, cut it off with a hobby knife, and then sand it smooth for a good finish. Working on the frame, the motor mount, transmission support and mid cross member, and the bogie cross member halves, and both of the rear frame member halves are attached to the left side of the frame. Now the right frame is attached to the pieces you've assembled, and then the chassis assembly can be sprayed with some gloss black paint. The rear air tank halves and the two tow hooks are painted gloss black to match the chassis and can be assembled to the frame. Now the tow hooks are installed, however they're not painted so that they can be seen in this view, but once that's done you can paint these pieces. Now we're going to use these parts, and once again we're going to assemble them. The rear cab support, both front cab supports, and the rear fender braces and both of the front fender braces are installed and painted gloss black and attached of course to the assembly, the chassis there, and painted black for finish. Now the front springs can be painted gloss black and attached to the chassis assembly. Grab these pieces from the kit, and after we've attached those to the chassis, for clarity you can paint them gloss black like the rest of the chassis, and they include the rear suspension carrier and the right one, and both suspension carrier inners, the cross tube left rear leaf spring along with the right, and both cross tube ends. Now the left rear suspension carrier can be attached to the left side of the chassis. A suspension carrier inner then is attached to the left suspension carrier and the chassis as well. And now the cross tube end cap is attached to the left rear suspension carrier. The cross tube gets slid through the suspension inner carrier and attached to the left rear suspension carrier. Now the second suspension carriage inner gets placed on the other end of the cross tube. The right suspension carrier then is attached to the right side of the chassis, and the second suspension carrier inner and cross tube. Now the cross tube end cap gets attached to the right rear suspension carrier, and the left rear leaf spring can be attached to the left rear suspension section carrier, and then the right leaf spring can be attached to the right rear suspension carrier. Look for these pieces in your kit, and then the rear axle halves are assembled, and then the rear axle gearbox halves are put together. Now the rear axle gearbox assembly is attached to the rear axle, and the backing plate is attached to both sides of the rear axle assembly. Now, the parking brake chamber can be attached to the backing plate, and then the rear axle assembly is painted gloss black. Assemble the center axle halves there, and then the gearbox for the center axle can be assembled. Now, the center axle gearbox assembly then can be attached to the center axle assembly. Now, a backing plate can be attached to both sides of the center axle assembly, and then the air chamber, and it gets attached to each backing plate. Now the center axle assembly and the inner axle drive shaft can be painted gloss black. Here you can see the center axle assembly and the rear axle assembly are installed onto the chassis assembly. Use these parts and the four lower and upper track rods and the two anti-skid controls then can be painted gloss black. And the upper track rods are attached to the axle assemblies and the bogie cross member. Now the lower track rods attached to the suspension carriers and the axle assemblies. The anti-skid controls then are glued to the chassis assembly by the bogie cross member. Here are the metal axles, and then the metal axle can be gently tapped into a rear brake drum with a small light hammer, and the other end of the axle is slid through the rear axle assembly there, and a second tire assembly can be pressed onto the exposed metal axle on the other side and tapped into position. Now repeat this process for the other metal axle and the other two rear tire assemblies and the center axle assembly. Now we can move to the front end, and the front axle and the tie rod are assembled and then installed onto the chassis assembly. The axle pin then can be installed into the axle pin retainer, and then an axle pin retainer cap is attached to the axle pin retainer. Repeat this process for the other axle pin assembly. Now the axle pin assemblies are attached to the front axle, and then the front axle assembly can all be painted a gloss black. Get these pieces out, and the steering gear box mount is attached to the left frame of the chassis, and the steering box then is attached to the steering gear box. Now the transfer lever is attached to the left frame, and then the power steering cylinder is slid through the left rear fender brace and attached to both the left frame and the chassis and to the transfer lever. Now the pitman arm can be attached to the power steering cylinder and the steering box. Steering link halves are assembled and then attached between transfer lever and the front axle. Now all these can be painted gloss black. Now we can snap the front tire assemblies onto the front axles. Grab the pieces here, the axle and the exhaust pipe, and they're painted gloss black. Then the drive shaft is attached to the center axle gearbox, and the engine assembly can be installed into the chassis assembly and attached to the drive shaft using the mounting points and making sure to remove any paint so that the glue will adhere to the pieces. Now the exhaust pipe is attached to the manifold on the right front cab support as well, and there is a groove on the exhaust pipe where the right front cab support will attach to that. Locate these pieces, and then the hydraulic fluid tank halves are assembled and sprayed with some satin black before it's attached to the left side of the chassis. The hydraulic pump halves are then assembled and painted gloss black and attached to the hydraulic fluid tank. Now the power takeoff is painted gloss black and attached to the left side of the transmission. The hydraulic pump drive shaft then is painted gloss black and attached between the hydraulic pump and the power takeoff. Assemble the left fuel tank halves, and the fuel tank ends are then attached to those, and repeat the process for the right fuel tank assembly. Now both fuel tank assemblies are sprayed with some satin black, and the steps and the fuel caps are attached to the fuel tank assemblies. Now the fuel tanks then are installed onto the chassis assembly. Locate these pieces, and the muffler box halves then are assembled to the muffler brackets and attached to the back of the muffler box. Now the muffler box assembly can be painted gloss black, and then the heat shield for the muffler is installed. Now the muffler box assembly can be attached to the right side of the chassis and the exhaust pipe. Air tank pieces here, and the right air tank halves and the left ones are assembled and sprayed some satin black. Then the air tank assemblies are attached to the chassis on both sides. The kit comes with both battery boxes for each side, but only the right side battery box is used. The battery box bottom and the top are then painted gloss black, and the battery is painted flat black, and it is attached to the battery's box bottom. Now the box top then is attached to the bottom, and then the battery box assembly can be attached to the chassis. And finally, we move on to the interior, and it is painted flat black, and the gas pedal can be painted semi-gloss black. Now the gas pedal and the shifter are glued into the interior. Use these pieces to assemble the driver's seat with the back and the front, along with the rear seat, and paint those flat tan, and then the passenger seat base is semi-gloss black. Now both driver's seat support halves are assembled and painted semi-gloss black, and the passenger seat then is attached to the base, and then the passenger seat assembly can be attached to the interior. The driver's seat back then can be attached to the bottom, as we mentioned, and the front seat assembly is attached to the driver rear seat support assembly, and then the driver seat assembly entirety is installed into the interior. With these pieces, the firewall gets painted Italian red on the outside, the exterior, and flat black on the interior, and the heater and the suspended brake and clutch pedals are painted semi-gloss black and attached to the firewall. Now the firewall assembly can be attached to the interior. Find these parts for the instrument panels, and then the instrument panel back and the steering column get painted semi-gloss black. Now the instrument panel front is painted with some wood color, and the steering wheel gets painted gloss white. Now the instrument panel halves are assembled, and the instrument panel is detailed with some silver and some flat black. The steering column then is attached to the instrument panel assembly, and the steering wheel is attached to the column, and then the whole panel assembly can be installed into the interior. Work on the cab for the body, but a portion of it needs to be removed first. Now get out the body, and there are some assembly pieces that need to be removed. Clean it up, sand off any parting lines, and then the entire thing can be sprayed Italian red. After you get that done, the cab windows are then installed into the body using some white glue, and the interior assembly can then be installed into the body by looking for the locations and using some super glue or some epoxy glue to keep it into position. Look for the contact points where the body attached to the chassis. Make sure you scrape off any paint there and glue the cab into position. Paint the exhaust stack and the dump box pipe silver or an aluminum, and then the air intake is painted some flat black, some tester silver detailing, and tan. Then the exhaust stack and the dump box pipe are attached to the muffler. Now the air intake can be attached to the intake manifold and to the firewall. Assemble the two air cleaner halves, and then the top is attached to the air cleaner assembly. Now the assembly is attached to the right side of the body assembly. We'll use these pieces, and then the muffler halves are assembled, and the exhaust tips are assembled to the muffler assembly. Now the muffler bracket is painted silver and attached to the cab assembly. The muffler assembly then is attached to the exhaust stack and the muffler bracket. Now the curved brace and a straight mirror brace are attached to the right mirror, and the curved brace will then attach to the bottom of the right mirror. Now the right mirror assembly and the right hand grip can be attached to the cab. Using these parts, the two air horns are attached to the roof and the cab assembly. Now the roof light lens is attached to the roof light with some clear part cement and window maker, and then a repeat for the other four light assemblies. Now the roof light assemblies can be attached to the cab. Get these parts up out of the kit and clean up any seams or flash that need to be removed, and then the left and the right hood sections are attached to the hood. Now the hood assembly, left front fender and the right front fender can be painted with the Italian red, and now the mud flaps are painted flat black. Now the left front fender, the right front fender, and the hood are attached to the body assembly. Now don't glue the hood into place at this time. The mud flaps are then attached to the left and the right front fenders. These parts will be used next, and for this section the hood assembly was removed so you can see what's going on. The lower radiator hose and the upper, the sump guard and the shroud, are then painted flat black, and the radiator grill is detailed with some flat black as well. Now the radiator shroud can be attached to the grill, and then the grill assembly is installed into the body assembly. Now the lower radiator hose can be attached between the grill and the oil cooler, and the upper radiator hose can be attached between the radiator shroud and the water outlet. Now the sump guard is attached to the bottom of the chassis assembly. Using these parts, the hood handles and the emblems are attached to both sides of the hood. Then the hood hold downs are painted semi-gloss black, and those two are attached to each side of the hood assembly. Remove the pins from both fender reflectors and then attach them to the fenders, and using some testers clear part cement or some white glue, and the left side reflector bezel and the right side reflector bezel can be painted silver. Now the lenses are attached to the side reflectors with some clear glue. Then the left side reflector assembly and the right are attached to the body. The headlight lenses can be installed into the bezels with some clear part cement as well, and then the headlight assemblies are attached to the body. Now the wrong lenses were used in the side reflectors as seen in the figure here. Now they're supposed to be clear, or they're supposed to be amber, but they had showed that clear lenses were used in the instructions. With these parts, the grill guard gets sprayed with the Italian red and then installed onto the body, and the front bumper is painted semi-gloss black and attached to the chassis. The running light lenses are then installed into the bezels, and the testers clear with using some testers clear parts or white glue. Now both running light assemblies can be attached to the bottom of the front bumper. These chrome parts are next, and the straight mirror braces are attached to the left and the mirror assembly, and then that is attached to the left side of the cab, and then of course the left hand grip is also attached to the left side of the cab. These chrome pieces and the bracket here are next, and the bracket is sprayed with some red, Italian red, before it's attached to the left side of the cab, and then the lube finer halves are assembled, and then the assembly is attached to the bracket by the left cab door. Now the power steering reserve halves are assembled, then the power steering reservoir is attached to the bracket by the hood assembly. As with this and any of the chrome pieces, remove any of the chrome plating from the surfaces to be glued. Now attach the door handles to the cab assembly. Now we'll work on the bed, and the left side wall can be attached to the reinforcement, and the right side wall is attached to the right side wall reinforcement. Now the left sidewall assembly and the right one are sprayed with some sterling silver metallic. Now the two sideboards are painted Model Master wood color. The floor can be attached to the body's frame, and then the floor assembly painted with some sterling silver. The front wall can be sprayed with the silver, and then both the left and the right sidewall assemblies, along with the front wall, can be attached to the floor. I found it helpful to use some clamps that are designed for small projects like this to hold the sidewalls to the floor assembly until the glue is dry. You'll use these parts to assemble the cab hangover, and they're put together and then painted with the silver. Now attach those to the dump box assembly. These are the hydraulic pistons for the bed, and you'll need to be careful. First, the piston rod then is painted chrome silver. Now place the piston rod into one of the inner piston halves and attach the second inner piston half to the first. Now, if the piston is to be operational, be careful when you're gluing the halves together so that the inner piston halves are free to move. Paint those gloss black. Now the inner piston assembly can be placed into one of the outer piston halves and attached to the second outer piston half over the first. As stated, be careful if the piston is to be operational that you're gluing the outer piston halves together and it doesn't glue the center piston into place. Also note that you may need to address the interior side of the inner piston halves. You can see here with some red marker that they need to be sanded out if the piston is going to work. Otherwise, they don't have any effect on the assembly if the piston is not going to be operational. The lift cylinder housing halves are painted with some of the silver paint, and then when the two lift cylinder housing halves are assembled to the piston, the assembly then can be installed into them. Now the lift cylinder housing assembly can be added to the dump box. Now get these parts out, and the exhaust heat duct and the footstep are spray painted with some silver, and the release arm and the release handle can be painted gloss black. Now the exhaust heat duct is attached to the bottom of the front wall by the floor assembly there, and the footstep can be attached to the floor assembly and the left wall. Now the release handle is attached to the floor assembly as well by the front of the wall and the left side wall assembly together. Now release the release arm can be attached to the release handle and the floor assembly. The left box dump box I-beam frame and the right and both mudguard braces and the front mudguards and all four pivot plates then are painted gloss black. A left and right pivot plate then are attached to the left dump box I-beam frame before the left dump box I-beam frame can be attached to the floor assembly. A left and right pivot plate are then attached to the right dump box and then I-beam frame before the right dump box I-beam frame is attached to that assembly on the floor. Now there are markings on the body frame where the front mud guards and the braces are attached. The front mud guards and the front mud guard braces then can be attached there to the floor assembly. The two pieces of the tailgate are assembled to the hinges and attached to the assembly. Now the tailgate assembly can be sprayed silver and the tailgate snapped onto the dump box assembly. No glue is needed. The latch pins on the tailgate assembly don't line up very well, so I suggest that while the glue is still tacky, install the tailgate assembly onto the dump box assembly and set the hinges to where the latch pins will work properly. After the glue dries, you can remove the tailgate assembly and paint it to match the dump box. Locate these pieces. There are 4 short side handle rails and 2 long handrails there that can be sprayed silver. Now the 2 short side handrails and one long handrail are attached to each side of the wall assembly, and there are location marks on the sidewall assemblies for easy location of the side handrails. Find these parts and the two hydraulic piston mounting brackets, the hydraulic piston pivot, and both dump box guides and oil lines are then painted gloss black. Now the hydraulic piston pivot is placed, not glued, into one of the mounting brackets, and then attach the second hydraulic piston mounting bracket to the first one, securing the hydraulic piston pivot into place. Use caution to not get any glue on the hydraulic piston pivot. The two dump box guides then are attached to the second hydraulic piston mounting bracket, and the oil line is attached to the piston pivot. Grab these parts out of the kit with the mud flaps and the subframes, and the mud flap retainer is attached to the right rear mud flap, and then repeat for the left side. Now the rear mud flap assemblies can be painted flat black, the mud flaps that is, and also some semi-gloss black for the retainers. The left and the right wood subframes are painted Model Masters wood color, and then the left and right wood subframes are attached to the chassis assembly. I used a sanding stick and gently sanded the mud flaps, revealing the writing and the symbols on them, and then the metal pivot axle is slid through both of the wood subframes, and then the left and right rear mud flap assemblies are installed onto the metal pivot axle. I removed the rear mud flap assemblies and the metal pivot axle for easier assembly, and then the dump box can be installed onto the chassis assembly easier. Now the metal pivot axle then is slid through the 4 pivot plates and both wood subframes, locking the dump box assembly in and to the chassis there, and both rear mud flap assemblies can be installed onto the metal pivot axle. We'll use these parts to spray paint the light brackets there for the tail lights, a silver metallic, and then the 4 tail lights can be attached to both tail light brackets with some clear part cement, and then the tail light brackets are attached to the dump box assembly as shown. Tail light brackets were installed. It appears that the rear mud flap assemblies now have a little bit of angle to them. I couldn't see where that could be changed. Using some of the supplied tubing, the hydraulic line is attached between the piston pivot and the hydraulic fluid tank, and then another line is attached between the hydraulic piston pivot and the pump. This kit comes with several variations for putting decals on the dump truck, and here is a front and rear view of the build once it is completed. I used some extra tail lights and some amber lights to give the dump box a little more detail. Well, there you have it. This exceptionally good-looking dumper is available now, just recently re-released, and I was a little, disappointed by the generic decals, but it still looks great. It went together well. There were no massive flash issues or defects for molds. The parts were straight, and once you get it all put together, it looks absolutely terrific on your shelf. So if I were you, I'd go out and buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you liked this premium step-by-step scale model kit review. And so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can do that by clicking on the icon in the lower right hand of any of our reviews, or you can find us on Facebook or our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks!